created for the freed slaves. Liberia was created for the freed slaves. Before I continue, I tell you our customer Farouk of Uganda's quote, where we say, great minds are created in times of crisis. Great minds are created in times of what? Crisis. Liberia was a product of slave trade. The abolition of slave what? Trade. It was founded by the Americans in 1822. So we need to understand the reasons for the foundation of Liberia as a colony. So we are saying today, the high crime rate, like robbery, theft by the former slaves. The former slaves were participating in crimes like robbery. These ones were unwanted in America. So by this time they had to create Liberia for the freed what? Slaves. Because they didn't want these crime activities to take place in where? In America. Then the former slaves were idle and disorderly in America, hence bringing them to Liberia. They were idle and disorderly. In other words, they had nothing to do in America. That's why they had to create a country for them. That was Liberia. Then the mass unemployment by the Negro slaves in America. The Negro slaves who were in America were unemployed. So by this time, America decided to create Liberia for these unemployed people to get employment in where? In Liberia. Then the increase in population in America. We are saying today, as the population increased in America, it is this that led to the creation of Liberia. Because by this time the Americans didn't want high population, so they had to create Liberia for the freed slaves. I can tell you, the Americans, whatever they do, they tend to have a stronger cause. Another one, political problems like demonstrations organized by the former slaves. The former slaves started demonstrating in America. So by this time the Americans were against demonstrations. That's why they had to create Liberia for the freed slaves, because they were against the demonstrations of the former slaves. Another one, American government also wanted a colony for stopping slave trade, because America was agitating for stopping of slave trade, so it wanted a colony. That's why they established Liberia. Then the Negroes were openly segregated as unwanted people in the American society. The Negroes were segregated. They were discriminated as unwanted people in the American society. That's why they had to create Liberia for them, because they were segregated in America. They needed to promote Christianity and civilization. So by this time, there was a need to promote Christianity and civilization. So it was the need to promote Christianity and civilization in areas like Liberia. That's why Liberia was created. Then to get employment opportunities for the unemployed Americans who became administrators in Liberia. The Americans realized that some Americans were unemployed in America, so they had to create employments for them, like to become administrators in Liberia. That's why Liberia had to be created. Then Liberia had a favorable climate that favored agriculture. We are saying today, Liberia had a favorable climate that favored agriculture. That's why it had to be created. I can tell you there are key reasons why Liberia was created. Then the fertile soils in Liberia. We are saying today, Liberia had fertile soils. So by this, the Americans realized that they had to create Liberia because at one time they wanted to get raw materials from Liberia. And since it had fertile soils, they had to create it. Then the natural harbors of Liberia are in Monrovia, which became a calling station for ships. Because Liberia had good natural harbors, by this time, the Americans had to create it to use the good natural harbors. Then the fresh waters in Liberia, because it had many rivers and streams. So by this time, because of the fresh waters in Liberia, America had to create it because it realized that it could sustain itself at one time. Liberia was to provide market for the American manufactured goods. We are saying the Americans created Liberia because they wanted the market for their products which they were producing in America. And by this time, they had to create Liberia to get market for their manufactured goods. The former slaves were economically expensive to the Americans. They were economically expensive in America. So by this time, they realized that they had to create a state in Africa. That's why they had to create Liberia. Then the involvement in the American War of Independence by helping the British. We are saying the former slaves involved in the American War of Independence, where they helped the British against the Americans, which annoyed the Americans, hence the foundation of Liberia for them. Then the need for a home for the former slaves. America wanted to create a home for the former slaves. That's why it had to create Liberia to act as a home for the former slaves. Then they needed to get a source of the raw materials for their industries. By this time, they wanted to get a source of raw materials, and they realized that Liberia, since it had fertile soils and everything, it could work for them. That's why it was created. Then Liberia had a lot of vacant land for settlement and agriculture. Liberia had a lot of vacant land for settlement and agriculture. That's why they had to create it, my friend. Then at this time we are saying it was near the ocean, hence a convenient area to settle the freed black slaves. So by this time there are key reasons why Liberia was created. Then you cannot delete out the role of the humanitarian organizations in America that looked at slavery as evil. So by this time, in a bid to abolish slave trade, they had to create Liberia for the freed slaves. So I can tell you there are key reasons why Liberia was created. Why Liberia